This episode is brought to you by Raisin UK, the online savings marketplace giving you access to competitive interest rates from over 40 FSCS-protected banks and building societies. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link below or go to raisin.co.uk/PensionCraft. After 6 decades at the helm, Warren Buffett has announced he'll step down as CEO of Berkshire Hathaway later this year. Widely regarded as one of the greatest investors of all time, Buffett is celebrated for his disciplined value investing approach, folksy charm, and willingness to share his wisdom.
But as the Oracle of Omaha prepares to hand over the reins, can Berkshire thrive without him? And in today's dumb question of the week, why aren't there more investors like Warren Buffett? All right, let's get into it. So there was big news, wasn't there, at the weekend, Romin? And I saw it reported everywhere as the surprise announcement that Warren Buffett is stepping down. But can it really be that much of a surprise when a 94-year-old decides to retire?
Well, he hinted at it, but apparently he hadn't told people that he was going to make the announcement, except for a couple of family members who were on the board.
Yeah, even the CEO-to-be, who was sitting next to him when he sort of announced it on stage at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, had pretty much no idea, I think. And he sort of looked a bit bewildered and stood up and joined in the applause with everyone like, wow, the keys to the kingdom are mine.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that's not a poisoned chalice. It's not an understatement to say that those are huge shoes to fill. Plus, expectations are just so high that someone's going to be able to take over and do what Warren Buffett did in the past. And I'm not sure that Warren Buffett could do what he did in the past.
No, because what he did in the past was incredible. Let's just briefly remind everyone on the return stats for Berkshire Hathaway. So Buffett took control in 1965. And since then, Berkshire stock has risen 40,000-fold, right? So according to Warren's own calculations, Berkshire has gained more than 5 million% from 1964 through 2024, which compares with a measly 39,000% for the S&P 500. So to put that in numbers we understand a bit more, if you annualize the average return, the S&P 500 over that period's done a little over 10%, I think around 10.4%, whereas Berkshire Hathaway has done almost 20%, 19.9% to be specific. So almost double the S&P on an annual basis.
Imagine having a share price which is just under $1 million. It's kind of crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's presumably why they have a dual share class structure.
But even the baby Bs, the Berkshire Hathaway B shares, those are worth something like $540, so still pretty expensive.
Thank goodness for fractional shares, eh?
It's funny, I was talking to Laura about this at the weekend, and she was saying, oh, is it possible to buy fractional shares of Berkshire Hathaway? And I thought, wait a minute, what's she doing? Buy Berkshire Hathaway.
Well, we should say right now, actually, that we're recording this before markets open on Monday. So we don't really know what's going to happen to Berkshire stock when the market gets a chance to express its opinion on Buffett stepping away.
Yeah, my guess is that it won't be that much of a shock. In effect, it was already Greg Ael running the company. But if there is a secret source behind their success, I think that a large part of it was Warren Buffett. And of course, the magic interaction between him and Charlie Munger.
But I think it's important to remember that of that 5 million% return, a huge amount of it came early on, right? In recent years, maybe as much as a decade, it has underperformed the broad market.
Yeah, whenever I used to make videos about Warren Buffett, I always used to show that kind of envelope function, which showed the huge fluctuations in return, obviously, because he's got a lot of equity. But there was a general decay from the 60s down to the present day in terms of the knockout years. The huge successes are just so difficult to generate nowadays, given the size of the stock.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it the case that it's harder for them because it's so big now? Like, how do you move the needle when it's a $1.2 trillion company? Or is it the case that maybe there was more alpha possible back in the 60s? Information was not as widely available as it is now. And there was presumably less capital floating around and you were fishing in a smaller pool.
So as of May, Berkshire Hathaway makes up about 2% of the S&P 500, and it's number 6 in the weighting table. So it's a really weird circularity here. He owns lots of stocks in the US, and the stock index in the US owns a part of his company. But to go back to your point about it scaling and not being able to do the stuff that they did in the past, well, of course, that's true. If you're going to be buying small caps, you'd have to buy the whole company. And so a large part of the investable universe is just shut off to them, unless they're willing to buy huge numbers of those tiny companies and not so tiny companies. For them, tiny would be a pretty chunky market capitalization.
So what do we think then? Is this a good time for Buffett to step down? Because if you look at it on paper, Berkshire stock is at a record high. It's done extraordinarily well this year. So since the start of 2025, it's up around 20%, whereas the broad S&P 500 is down around 3%. Also, in terms of valuation, it's looking quite toppy compared to its recent history. So on a price to book ratio, it's at a 15-year high at around 1.8 times compared to more like 1.5 in recent years. And that's coming against a backdrop where its operating earnings are decent, but I wouldn't say they're blowout. So in the first quarter, they were down around 14%. And if you look at it in terms of GAAP accounting, it was actually a huge drop, 64%, but that was largely due to just paper losses on its stock portfolio. Buffett says to ignore that.
Well, look, from the point of view of quitting while you're ahead, I think, yeah, it was spot on. And you wouldn't want to leave in the middle of a crisis or some kind of loss or a bad deal. But of course, time was running out for Warren. He's already 94. So eventually the Grim Reaper was going to make this decision for him.
Maybe it's better that he stepped away before that happens, though, because now at least it can be a bit of a soft handover, right? It's not just a sudden, wow, we've woken up and there's a bit of a vacuum that someone has to step into.
Yeah, I can just imagine all the leader writers were crossing out some kind of eulogy and changing it to retirement. But
yeah. Well, I wondered if that's why he decided to step away before he died, was because now he can read his own eulogies. You saw the press over the weekend.
Maybe it's because it's a round number. It's been 60 years at the helm.
Yeah.
And that's an amazingly long record and also a largely successful record, which is pretty unusual, I'd say, for anyone working for any company.
He is unique in many ways. I like that he made the announcement in such an understated, casual way, as is his kind of typical approach. So he did this 4-hour-long Q&A session at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, which is normal, maybe even a little less than what he's done in the past. And then in the last 5 minutes, he just said, well, I've got a bit of news, basically, before I go. And then he had to sort of tolerate a standing ovation. He looked really uncomfortable during it and then cut it short after a minute. And then he just said, well, there's your news hook for the week.
It is a bit suspicious, though, that the Apple CEO, Tim Cook, was there, Bill Gates was there, and Hillary Clinton was there. So you just wonder, did they know something was coming? It was a pretty good bet, wasn't it?
But there's always famous people there, aren't there?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Like Bill Ackman was there as well. I did notice that earlier on in the Q&A, Buffett called out Tim Cook and he stood up. And Warren said, you should all be thanking Tim because he has actually made more money for Berkshire Hathaway than I ever have.
That's a great quote.
Yeah. This is interesting. Maybe Warren's looked at the stats and seen that his holding of Apple just delivered so much in absolute cash terms.
Yeah, you've just got to make some really good choices, haven't you? And that's pretty much set up their performance over the last 5-10 years.
I think that's always the approach Warren has, that you just need to get a few big decisions right. And he said that Charlie Munger, his previous partner on this, was even more extreme. So Buffett says, oh, maybe we made like 50 big decisions in our investing career. And Munger says we'd have done a lot better if it was just 5 decisions.
And if you look at their holdings right now, they've got Apple, that makes up about a quarter of their portfolio, American Express, Coca-Cola, Bank of America, Chevron. And it is very concentrated, which it always is.
And of course, they also have a big portfolio of wholly owned businesses, which is sprawling across lots of different industries. They are, of course, a big conglomerate. So maybe their most significant business is Geico, which is an insurer in America. And that generates a lot of float, as they call it, where you've kind of got this cash generated every year where people are buying insurance products, but you don't have to pay out any claims on them for a bit of time. And that's kind of cheap money for Buffett to invest. That's always been his tactic. Very cheap leverage. But then you've got other things. You've got the BNSF Railroad. You've got Berkshire Hathaway Energy, which is a huge utility company. And then you've got lots of consumer-facing businesses like Dairy Queen, See's Candy, Fruit of the Loom. And then some more unusual things like NetJets, a private jet company. So it's really hard to classify Berkshire. You could say they've all come into the portfolio from a value investing approach, but they're not concentrated in one industry. And even their stock portfolio, where it's not wholly owned, it's just shares of different businesses, that's quite diverse. You've got banks in there, energy companies, even some tech like Apple, like you said.
And rating agencies like Moody's, which is quite a weird one. Now, one of the things we've mentioned in the past when we've talked about Warren Buffett was that he's got a lot of cash currently in his portfolio. So he's got a record cash reserve in nominal terms of 348 billion. And he actually acknowledged that there's more cash and treasury bills than he'd prefer currently. But clearly, that's a sign that he doesn't see a lot of deals in the making at the moment, given where valuations are.
You say he's got more treasury bills than he'd prefer. He owns 5% of the treasury bill market. This is the short-dated US treasuries, more than the Fed. And this cash pile is growing. So as we said, their operating businesses kick off a huge amount of cash every year. So even if they do nothing, they're adding around $40 billion each year to this cash pile.
So perhaps that's one of the things that's going to change in the future under the new leadership. But I think at the moment, they're probably going to be quite cautious in terms of their allocations, their deal making, not to rock the boat, particularly during this period of transition.
It's really interesting because Buffett says that one of the reasons he's been able to outperform over the years is because there is no obligation on him to be fully invested at all times. Whereas for most fund managers, they can't just keep a load of cash on the sidelines and wait for the opportunities.
Yeah, because they'd lose their job, they'd get fired. You can't really be a fund manager if you say, oh, actually, I'm taking my money off the table right now.
But Buffett's prepared to wait, and he can wait.
But then when it rains gold, he puts out the buckets. And he really is a buyer of last resort, pretty much like the Fed, in the sense that when everything's in super crisis mode and it's all doom and gloom, that's when he deploys a lot of capital. So he's not scared to use it, and he often times it very well.
But interestingly, in this dip we've had this year, he doesn't seem to have, bought the dip in April at all. Over the last quarter, they were actually a net seller of stocks, as they have been for a few years now. So last year, they sold over $130 billion of net stocks, mostly Apple. They decided to shrink that holding a bit. And this year so far, they've been a net seller of around $1.5 billion worth of stock.
Yeah, that's right. He downplayed the volatility we've seen in 2025 and called it really nothing, which for some people was quite difficult to absorb, I suspect. But he said, look, if a 15% drop in your stocks causes you distress, then you should rethink your investment philosophy. And he said, the world's not going to change for you. You must adjust to the world.
So yeah, clearly this didn't meet Buffett's criteria as a major opportunity. He hasn't been buying stocks. And interestingly, he hasn't even been buying back Berkshire stocks, which was something he was doing in recent years. And he actually stopped in May of last year, presumably because he thinks they don't represent value at the moment.
Yeah, and if you look at what they own, you can see why they might be considering that their holdings are expensive. It only adds value to the shareholders if you buy back when those valuations are lower. But what's very odd is the way they treat cash. Now, shareholders would be screaming if this was another company for them to pay them the cash as a dividend.
A special dividend now, please.
Yeah. And yet that's not happening, at least not under Warren's leadership.
I mean, his justification was always, the cash is better in my hands. Like, I can grow it faster than you can, Mr. Random Investor.
Which was actually a fair point in his case.
And I think people generally buying Berkshire stock don't want him to just give them their money back, right? That's not why you're buying it.
So I'm just looking at the fundamentals of Berkshire Hathaway stock, and I'm looking at dividend yield, and it's a nice round number. Can you guess what it is?
Well, given they've never paid a dividend, I'm going to say 0% yield. Keep giving me these softball questions.
I have to make you look smart, Michael, although I don't really need to. And clearly in this period of transition, he doesn't want to rock the boat by selling some of his own shares. That's the ultimate insider dealing. And it would send a terrible signal to investors. So he said he has no intention, zero, of selling one share of Berkshire Hathaway. What he's going to do instead is gradually give it away to other people.
Yeah, it was interesting that was the line which got everyone standing up with a big wild round of applause. Yes, Warren, you're not going to crash my holdings. We actually mentioned him, didn't we, on the recent podcast about the biggest whales and how this transition could be painful if he had decided to sell it down in a hurry. But obviously he's not going to do that.
And one thing I loved was after a 4-minute standing ovation when he announced his retirement, he said, the enthusiasm shown by that response can be interpreted in 2 ways, but I'll take it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure people were shocked, right? They wouldn't want him to go, and they definitely wouldn't want him to sell his stake. Because remember, Buffett owns around 14% of Berkshire, with his stake valued at $160 billion. And he also controls 30% of the voting rights because he owns a lot of these super voting Class A shares.
But look, while he's alive, he's going to be there in the background, suggesting things. This episode is sponsored by Raisin UK, the online savings marketplace where you can compare competitive interest rates from over 40 banks and building societies, all FSCS protected. Whether you're after flexibility or a fixed return, Raisin UK makes it easy to find and manage your savings in one place. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link below or go to raisin.co.uk/PensionCraft.
So I think it's fair to say that this really does represent the end of an era, both for Berkshire Hathaway, obviously, but also I think for American capitalism. Like, this was the cute, cuddly grandfather of American corporate life, and he's now no longer going to be there, at least day to day. But someone has to step into his shoes and do this impossible job, and that man is Greg Ael.
So a Canadian import. I just wonder if there's going to be some kind of tariff on that.
Well, he's already over the border. I think he's living in Des Moines? I don't know how you pronounce that town.
Des Moines,
yes. Originally, this man is from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and is a trained accountant.
Well, look, if you're going to have one job title before you take over this role, I think accountant would be a good one. He also specialises in the energy sector, I believe, which is where he moved after he moved away from PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Yeah, his background is really energy. So he actually joined the Berkshire empire when Buffett bought a controlling stake in what was called at the time Mid-American Energy, and he was the president there. And then gradually he's sort of risen up the ranks in Berkshire as he built that energy company out by making really strategic acquisitions over the years. And then in 2014, I believe it was renamed Berkshire Hathaway Energy, at which time it had become one of the major power companies in the US, especially in places like Iowa and Nevada. And they also own natural gas pipelines, which deliver fuel across the country.
What was surprising to me was that his move upwards in the ranks in Berkshire Hathaway towards the top job was actually quite recent. So in 2018, he was named vice chairman of Berkshire and also head of the company's non-insurance operations. Not that long ago.
Yeah, so about 7 years ago, he expanded his portfolio to take on everything other than the insurance business, which was still run by Ajit Jain, who was another person who's been there a long time.
Because some people thought it might have been Ajit Jain that took over.
Yeah, but Ajit Jain's a bit older. He's, in his 70s. I mean, Greg Abel's 62, right? They're not exactly going for young people. This is like appointing a new pope, isn't it? You're given, this isn't your usual succession, is it?
Yeah, the conclave is never going to be a bunch of spring chickens.
But it is unusual, right? Someone who's in their 60s, like Greg Ael, would usually be looking to wind down their career, right? And maybe take on a few board positions elsewhere and work 2 days a week or whatever. But this guy's now going to be running one of the biggest companies in the world.
Now, I remember in 2021, Charlie Munger actually let it slip that Greg Ael would be taking over. And later on, Buffett told CNBC, the directors are in agreement that if something were to happen to me tonight, it would be Greg who'd take over tomorrow morning. So that was kind of patching over the damage.
Yeah, definitely. I think Munger didn't really give much of an F at that point. Would just say what was on his mind on stage.
About anything, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. But the point Charlie Munger made actually was interesting. He said that Ael was chosen because he would keep Berkshire's unique culture intact.
And Buffett made lots of nice comments about him. For example, he said, Greg Ael does all the work and I take all the bows. He's a big improvement on me, but don't tell anybody.
It's a classic Buffett kind of quote, isn't it? It's like mock humble.
Yes. But I think what really characterises the management of the wholly owned companies for Berkshire Hathaway, this incredible collection of very diverse companies, is that once they've become part of the fold, they're pretty much left to get on with it. If they need capital, they'll inject it if it's required. But otherwise, they just let them do their thing. But I'd question whether that's going to be the case under Greg Ael. It sounds like he's much more of a hands-on guy.
He seems to be very different to Buffett in terms of his professional experience and, what he's seen as being good at. So Buffett, you would say, basically is a stock picker, maybe the greatest of all time. Whereas Greg Ael has built his reputation running businesses. He's an operations guy, like we said, in the energy sector largely.
Now, of course, these are going to be rosy quotes because these are people who currently work with him and who he'll be the future boss of. But for example, Chris Kelly, who's CEO of Home Services in America, said he's a leader who challenges teams to think deeper. And also, you come away smarter from having a conversation with him.
I mean, he seems like a really smart guy. He sat next to Buffett on stage throughout this meeting, like Munger used to do. And everything he said made sense. And he seemed confident in himself, as you'd expect, right? This is a billionaire in his own right who's been handpicked by Warren Buffett. That's got to be good for your confidence.
I think the real test of his mettle will come when there's a huge crisis, whenever the next one is, if he even makes it that long. Because that really tells apart the really good allocators from the ones who aren't so good.
Yeah, and there's something really interesting on that point. Because Buffett said that, and I quote, "I'll still hang around and could conceivably be useful in a few cases, but the final word would be what Greg said." And he went on to say that these cases where he could be useful are probably in those times of crises, where he's seen as the Oracle of Omaha, and people come to him as a buyer of last resort. And are they going to come to Greg? Maybe, maybe not. But I think Buffett still sees himself as the person who might be worth talking to in that situation.
But this is the last thing a manager wants, which is to have the previous boss just looking over his shoulder.
Yeah, I'm a long-suffering Man United fan now. And I just remember after Sir Alex Ferguson retired, after like 26 years of unparalleled success, and he just sat in the stands every week as manager after manager watches their team lose.
Oh.
It could be that situation, right? I mean, it's unclear whether Buffett's going to stay on as chairman, as far as I understand it. I think the intention is that Buffett's son, Howard Buffett, who is 70 and already a board member, will become chairman at some point.
What do they call that? A Nepo baby?
They do, yeah. A 70-year-old baby.
Everything's relative. But another person that could have done it would have been Ajit Jain. But like you said, he's 73 and he's probably thinking of retirement to spend more time with his money.
Yeah, if Jain goes as well, then they'll have lost Munger, Buffett, and the head of insurance in just like 2 years. For a company that doesn't have change very much in terms of decades, that's a fast-moving revolution.
So I'd say governance is an important thing to think about. Who's going to be making sure that they don't go off-piste when it comes to strategy?
And also, who's going to be picking the stocks? Because like we've said, Greg Ael is more of an operations guy. Like I'd expect him to be in charge of big mergers and acquisitions. That's his background. But in terms of who's going to buy the next Apple, like the 10% stake in it or whatever, presumably that's going to be Todd Combs and Ted Weschler. And so they've been with the company like 15 years or so. But as of now, they only manage around 10% of Berkshire's $300 billion equity portfolio. Are they going to be handed the keys to the whole thing? Buffett seemed to hint that they weren't.
And Abel does not have a track record in stock picking. And imagine the pressure he's under. He's going to have good advice. He's going to have good people helping him. But I hate to say this, he's no Warren Buffett.
No, but who is, right?
And that's the fundamental problem. It's really difficult to find someone who people would trust to make good decisions. And he has so much capital to deploy, and there's so much pressure to make a good decision early on that I think that could cripple him when it comes to making a decision.
That's the biggest thing he has to weigh up to begin with, isn't it? We've got this record cash pile. What do we do with it? Do we go down the conventional route that I'm sure institutional investors will be telling him to do, which is pay a dividend, give me back some of that money? Or does he do what Berkshire usually does and hoard it for a rainy day?
All into Bitcoin. That's my prediction.
Well, that is not keeping the continuity of the culture, Roman.
Charlie Munger loved Bitcoin.
Yeah, all in Bitcoin and buy a sports team. Let's just go off the rails.
Now, when it comes to corporate culture, I'd say that Berkshire Hathaway is a bit of a square peg in a round hole. It isn't conventional. For example, if you look at their headquarters, I think they've got 25 employees based in their central office in Omaha. And that team is responsible for managing the entire empire.
It's basically Buffett in a Bloomberg terminal and some people bringing him coffee, I think. I don't know.
And Coca-Cola, obviously.
Yeah.
And See's Candy.
I'm sure we're underselling it. I'm sure they're all brilliant, those 25 people. But it's largely centered around Buffett, isn't it? And I guess people like Ajit Jain.
Another big problem, I think, for shareholders is the way they communicate. Now, normally with the company, you get quarterly earnings, you get calls with journalists, but instead of that, you get this crazy jamboree every year where they kind of say, buy C's candies, buy our plush toys, go and eat at this local restaurant, which is bizarre for a huge company.
It's the Woodstock of capitalism. That's what they say, Robin, this Berkshire annual meeting. But it's weird, right? I've watched it in the past and I've watched most of it this year. It's definitely not the equivalent of an earnings call where you've got analysts asking difficult questions about sales projections and margins and things like that. It's like a 14-year-old stands up and says, Mr. Buffett, you're my hero. How do I become more like you? I mean, you gave me some softball questions earlier, but this is basically what a large part of that is. And that is not going to be relevant to like seasoned investors and institutional investors.
And I think that'll be a shame because, every company in America is essentially a monoculture. And this really stood out as something that was successful and not the same.
Yeah.
So it'll be a pity to see that change.
I don't think they will change it, at least initially. But then if it's 4 hours of Greg Ael answering questions, does anyone want to see that?
My big question is he going to eat C's candies and drink Coca-Cola, just like Warren and Charlie?
I mean, I'm sure that's the question that all the pension funds will be asking. Will you be continuing to drink cherry cola on stage? But seriously, though, Berkshire doesn't even have an investor relations department, which for $1 trillion company is extraordinary. And I applaud it because all of that stuff is a bit meaningless. But maybe more to the point is their financial disclosures are pretty limited. Like, obviously, they comply with the law, but they don't tend to break out the performance in depth of the different businesses, like Geico, for example, so that investors could really drill into it and think, is this doing well in its own right? Or should I be pressuring Berkshire to sell some of these things?
And I wonder, now that Warren Buffett's gone, whether there's going to be pressure from the government to unlock some of that capital in order to stimulate the economy, because it is a huge piggy bank. And you look at what the UK government's doing, trying to get pension funds to invest in infrastructure in the UK. I wonder whether that's going to be a threat to it in the future.
Interesting. I hadn't considered that angle that the government would be pressuring them to run down the cash. I mean, you've got to remember that the cash is held in treasury bills. So the government's... So there's a disincentive there for the government to say sell it all. But I think the pressure will come from the big institutional investors, and the investment banks will be on to the management team to, potentially break up the company. That would be the obvious thing. Conglomerates are out of fashion generally. Berkshire owns, I think it's 189 different businesses, like wholly owned businesses, in wildly different sectors. And as you said earlier, they're generally left to get on with it. So it's not a slam dunk argument that you want to keep it all bundled up together in a conglomerate.
I'd say a more likely bad outcome would be if they underperform, they do some deals which go a little bit wrong, not great returns, and then people are crying out for a change in leadership, and eventually there's some kind of shareholder revolt.
Yeah, that's a concern. But I guess the immediate concern is, will existing shareholders of Berkshire hang on to their shares? Or will they be like, well, Buffett's gone, the secret sauce is gone, now's the time to sell. Let's just do what Buffett said we should do once and put it all on the S&P 500.
Yeah, I never bought any Berkshire, and I don't think I would now. Certainly not now, because I don't think the secret sauce was really there towards the end. And that's even more the case now that Warren's gone.
I mean, you never bought any Berkshire directly, but you've always held quite a lot of Berkshire just by virtue of the passive index, like you said earlier.
Yeah, it's a percentage of a percentage, but I never bought concentrated exposure. It was never in my fund portfolio. It just wasn't fun enough.
This year it's been fun, like we said, 20% up.
Yeah, I guess it's been a good year. But will that continue? Or were they just lucky in terms of what they held? That's always the case, even with Warren Buffett. If you've got a concentrated portfolio, you're going to have good years.
On the question of will Berkshire succeed beyond Buffett, maybe we should look at Berkshire through the lens of Warren Buffett's own investment principles and ask, would a fictional Warren Buffett invest in Berkshire right now? So maybe the first concern there is what he always mentions is, does the company have a moat? I guess you would say if Berkshire ever had a moat, it would have been Buffett himself and his kind of brilliance, or at least his reputation of brilliance. Like, people would bring him deals at opportune times.
All you've got now is the scale that's left over from his leadership. And scale on its own isn't enough. If you've got a supertanker with a lousy captain, well, that's not an opportunity, that's a threat.
I mean, we're not saying that Greg Abel's going to be a lousy captain, but it's hard to make a call either way. Like, I'm sure he's a competent manager, but is he Warren Buffett?
So I think what's left of the moat is its scale and its really unique structure. The float is still a big benefit. I think that's going to benefit the company forever because of its structure. And also the choice of companies that it's got will also be a benefit because it's very diversified. But like you say, if you look at the valuation of the company itself, the fact they haven't been buying back their own shares tells you it's currently looking quite expensive.
Well, that's maybe the second point here is if we're looking at it through the Buffett lens, he always says you want to buy wonderful businesses at a fair price. Berkshire, wonderful business, I guess. Is it at a fair price? Well, they're not buying it themselves anymore. The other point that Buffett always makes is that you need to understand a business if you want to buy it. Now, do you understand Berkshire Hathaway? Well, it has 189 different operating businesses. That's a lot of understanding you've got to do.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can really get their head around it. If you read the annual report, it just is very difficult to make out exactly what's going on because of the complexity, like you say.
But Buffett kind of pulls the wool over our eyes with like amazing anecdotes from the 70s or whatever, and how he once bought an ice cream company or something like that. And we're like, wow, this man knows everything. Can we see some of the numbers? No.
Another thing that Buffett and Munger always stressed was the importance of strong management. And there's a great quote from Charlie Munger, which is, invest in a business any fool can run, because someday a fool will.
Yeah, I guess that's the key to succession planning, isn't it? You want it to sort of be so good, it's so hard to screw up. I mean, Buffett once said a ham sandwich could run Coca-Cola, which is one of the reasons he loved the business.
But we're not saying that Greg Ael is a ham sandwich, are we?
You know what he should do for sort of ironic purposes? Forget eating Sears candy and cherry Coke on stage. Just munch a ham sandwich. See if people get the joke.
Now, Warren Buffett espouses many of the great principles of investing, and that's something we try to pass on to our community. If you want to become part of that community and learn from all of us, you can do that very easily. Just go to PensionCraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. Why aren't there more investors like Warren Buffett?
Now, we have different opinions about this, Michael. My belief is that he was the result of special circumstances and timing. Because remember that if he started 60 years ago, that was a very different market to the market we see today. Information wasn't as widely available. You could argue that US capital markets weren't in such great shape. There wasn't as much liquidity as there is today. Information was much harder to find. So there were less efficiencies in the market. And I'd argue that that helped him to do the stock picking, which eventually boosted returns early on. That's not to say he wasn't incredibly skillful, he was. But there are many asset managers out there who are incredibly skillful, intelligent, and very capable.
Yeah, he definitely had kind of unique circumstances. He also had incredible mentors like Benjamin Graham. He was lucky to meet Charlie Munger at the right time, who pushed him away from just pure value investing, where he was looking at beaten up companies which were really cheap, to looking at quality companies which he could buy for a fair price and hold for the long term. But then, like you say, there were loads of people doing this. So I would perhaps argue that it's conceivable that Warren Buffett was just lucky. Like, if you've got so many people trying to beat the market over the last 60 years, he's maybe the only one that's done it consistently. But then, with that many people trying to beat the market, surely someone had to do it, and it was him.
So if we had monkeys at a typewriter, eventually there'd be a Warren Buffett monkey.
Yeah, eventually they'd buy Apple, just very late to the game. But like, do you not see my point? That, okay, I'm not saying he's not skillful, and it's definitely an advantage that he's lived so long, because that snowball rolled and rolled and rolled and got really big. But then to the question of why aren't there more investors like Warren Buffett? I mean, I think there's loads of investors like Warren Buffett. You look at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, there's 40,000 people there for a start who are trying to beat Warren Buffett. But then, as we know, it's just really hard to beat the market. But maybe it is possible. And the law of large numbers means here he is.
And if you look at his history, it's interesting how he almost stumbled into the current corporate structure which they've got. For example, when he first bought Berkshire Hathaway, it was just a struggling textile company, and it was a bit of a disaster. And at one point, I think he was thinking of throwing in the towel.
Yeah.
But then we started to go towards this insurance route, and that generated float. There was implicit leverage in the overall returns, and that's just been incredibly successful.
I mean, it does seem absurd, doesn't it, to say, oh, he's been lucky for 60 years and beaten the S&P 500 by like 10% per year. He's clearly not made massive mistakes. He's obviously made mistakes. He would be the first to admit that. You can look at things like overpaying for Kraft Heinz in recent years. He had a bad investment in Tesco, I think, at one point, didn't he? And maybe some of his biggest mistakes were actually the omissions. He says he should have bought Google when it was really young.
But to me, it's a little bit like the Fermi paradox in physics, which is, where are all the aliens? Surely if there was life that was widespread, we should be, rubbing shoulders with people from Sirius and Alpha Centauri. But we're not. And that makes you think, well, the odds might be pretty low of someone being the next Warren Buffett. And it's quite notable that in the UK, we don't have any Warren Buffetts.
I guess one point in response to that would be, he's only seen as Warren Buffett because he's done it for like 60 years. If he'd stopped after 40, he wouldn't be anywhere near as lionized because the compounding wouldn't have taken him to this huge amount of wealth where he's, got more than $100 billion. So maybe we do have other Warren Buffetts, but they get rich enough that they stop at like 20 years in and they're like, oh, I've had enough now. Whereas Warren, I don't think he's doing it for the money. He just loves to do it. He sees business as a game which he can win. But you see what I mean? You've got to do it for so long to be Warren Buffett that maybe people just don't want to do that.
I've actually heard a comparison where people showed that because he had wealth early on, that actually massively increased the total capital, which is in Berkshire Hathaway right now. So it's a combination of starting young, being consistent, and just keeping at it for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, and avoiding those cripplingly big mistakes which blow up the firm. Which is hard to do in 60 years. Like usually something comes along where you ruin it all.
And usually that involves leverage. So he did that. He kept things on a very even keel, didn't do anything crazy, made the best of opportunities. But I think you're right. I think a fair old sprinkling of luck didn't hurt at all.
He does acknowledge that, to be fair. He says he's one of the most lucky people ever to exist, I think. I mean, largely because he was born into the circumstances he was born. In America, at the right time, where being an expert capital allocator could make you incredibly rich. For most of history, you wouldn't have become incredibly rich if your main talent was capital allocation. You'd have been eaten by a leopard. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.